the people used to come visit me in Kasagawa when we were trying to figure this out, and they would look at the 100,000 hectares, 200,000 acres, and they'd go, "What the hell are you? Why aren't you getting carbon credits?" So after Kyoto, and I would run to the library and read about it. Back in those days, we had to do that. There was no internet, or it wasn't so prevalent. I couldn't ask ChatGPT, how do I benefit from this? So,
Welcome back to This Week in Carbon. I'm your host, Eddie Smith, alongside Renee Velasquez. And today we're thrilled to have Mike Korchinsky, founder of Wildlife Works, on the podcast. Mike, thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate you making the time, and we're looking forward to today's discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Ed. And nice to talk to you again. Renee, nice to see you. It's been some time.
Yeah, we've got quite a lot to cover, so I want to dive right into it. And I think for the first segment, it would be great to start out by, asking a big question. What inspired the founding of Wildlife Works in 1997, right? Because I read a bit about its beginnings, and there was a story about conflicts that you saw in Kenya, right? And I think I would love to ask, what was your initial vision for solving the whole wildlife versus community conflict that you saw in Kenya? Was that kind of the reasoning for Wildlife Works beginnings?
Yeah, I mean, I had a prior career in management consulting. I had a management consulting company that did large scale change management for really big companies. Some had 300,000 employees, and they had a brand new strategy that they paid millions of dollars for, and they looked out over their 300,000 employees and thought, gee, I know somebody has to do something different on Monday morning, but I really don't know who or what. And so they would hire us to come in and help them figure out like who and what has to do something different if they're actually going to pursue their new multi-million-dollar strategy. So that was my professional life prior to. I had been the company that I co-founded with a bunch of people had been acquired by a public company, and I was on the executive team of that public company. But I'd always promised myself I had a bit of time and money, I'd go to Africa because I've been an elephant aficionado for as long as I can remember, since I was a wee little kid reading Babar. And so I collected elephant figurines and this, that, but I lived in England and the US, and there are no elephants in either place. So I went to Kenya, and I was there with my wife just on a trip in 1995, actually. And I couldn't help but notice that this beautiful place that I was in, which was absolutely stunning and full of beautiful wildlife, but it had these weird things like electric fences and guys with guns walking around. And I started doing my consulting thing of asking stupid questions, and the answers I got were a little bit surprising to me, that the fences and the guns weren't for the animals, they were for people. And when I said, what people? And they said, well, exactly. If we didn't have the fences and guns, you'd be seeing a lot of people here. And so that got me interested. I was like, oh, interesting. What kind of people? And so so I asked them to take me out of the private retreat that I was on and into go see these people. And they drove me out out of the boundary of this place, which was fenced. And we drove for about 15 minutes, and then we stopped in a village, or town, actually. And we got out, and then I thought it was maybe a water break or something. And then I said, what are we doing here? And they said, there they are. And they waved their hand. These guys that were managing this piece of private land, they waved their arm at 5,000 people. So there they are. And I had this sort of aha moment where the threat that they were so worried about, that was basically the people that live there and belong there. And so that got me thinking about why they were so threatening, and what this project was doing, or this Conservancy was doing to be welcome in this landscape where they had so many neighbors that seemed to resent them being there. So I got very curious about human wildlife conflict. It was a very unstudied topic in those days, and it was very hard to find anything about it, but I was able to find a little bit that got me on this path that, look, if we need wildlife or if we want wildlife, and I'm in both categories, I believe we need it, and I desperately want it to persist into the future, then we need to find economic solutions for these communities that share their landscape with the wildlife that they want, not ones that we tell them they need, but ones that they see as valuable. So the idea behind Wildlife Works is I believed then, and I still believe, that wildlife is an asset and the natural world is an asset, but it's not always easy to value that asset. And certainly for these communities that have been sometimes stripped of natural resources by colonials, et cetera, it's a challenge for them to benefit from their environment and not be in conflict with it. So the idea behind Wildlife Works is we need to find new models for these communities that are going to drive economic value to them that is based on the presence of wildlife and wilderness. And if we can't do that, then we're going to lose the wildlife, and that's what's happened in the rest of the world, where development was at odds with wildlife. So that was the onus. I literally came up with the name Wildlife Works on that trip. I spent about a year thinking about it and what we would do. I spent about the next 10 years paying to try and figure out how to make it work. And then eventually along came the carbon market and became a model that was very obviously appropriate for the kind of challenge that I saw in my travels. So that's the Wildlife Work started in 1997 with the concept of how do we bring market. It has to be the market because it's the only place that has enough money, and it's currently engaged in trashing the planet. And if we can't figure out how to redirect that funding to support the planet, then we're never going to have enough philanthropy to fix it. So part of it was, we need to engage the market in a positive way and have them be part of the solution, not the problem that we're trying to solve, because these solutions need to be economic for these communities. They need real economic growth potential. And then the second part of it was just there's plenty of people doing great work in the conservation space, and not nearly enough philanthropy to fund them all. So I didn't want to be another one of those people, looking for money in a very crowded space. So and the third thing is I just didn't know anything about being a nonprofit, having been a for-profit my entire career. So all those reasons I started Wildlife Works as a for-profit. We were extremely unprofitable for-profit for a good period of time, so we might as well have been nonprofit, to be honest. But because starting a business with a concept turns out not to be the fastest way to revenue. So we had to figure out, like, what is the product and what are the services that we're going to sell in order to bring the market to these communities. And we dabbled in a few things that failed miserably, and some that were successful, but nothing really compared to the carbon market. When the carbon market showed up, and of course, the carbon market showed. Kyoto was after we founded Wildlife Works. So Kyoto, the protocol happened later, and then to my chagrin, they excluded the category of natural forest protection or wilderness protection from Kyoto, and the only nature solutions were forestry or plantation. Which is, lots of silly reasons and some really obvious reasons why that happened. But we had to wait until 2005 really before REDD Plus became a thing in the world, and then we were looking, right? Because I had a concept, and I was looking to how am I going to connect the market to these communities in a way that they'll value their wilderness and forest and wildlife. And we'd already established a relationship with this community in Kenya, having worked with them for, by then, 7 years, trying to work with them to figure out what would work. And then when carbon came along, I really felt that was the right model. And so we invested pretty heavily in learning about what the carbon market could mean and how you would run a REDD project. And we, as you probably know, we wrote one of the first methodologies that under the Verra system for avoided deforestation.
Yeah.
And we did that because we nobody had done it. The Verra had announced in 2008 that they were going to support avoided deforestation REDD Plus as part of their standard, but they hadn't actually produced a methodology to use to do a project yet by 2009 when we started up the carbon effort there. So it was somewhat a series of evolutions of the market evolving and us, being looking for that solution and then jumping on it and then trying to go as quickly as we could because we knew these communities didn't have a lot of time before they would have to make decisions that were irreversible
Mm.
regard to their own environment. So
Mike, that's
yeah,
fascinating. Can I just ask a quick question here and jump in? Sorry,
yeah,
Eddie. Because you're taking us back to 1997, and then, as you said in that explanation, it wasn't until 2009 that there was actually some traction on the intersection between the conservation approach and carbon markets, right? And then you played this catalytic role in helping to define and develop the first methodologies, and then ultimately establish the first project, right? And then prove effectively that community-led conservation could be scaled and financed. Can you take us through those early days around the first methodology, the project implementation, and then ultimately that intersection and adoption by the market? Because I think that's a fascinating historical lesson that's oftentimes lost. There's a lot of vitriol and just a lot of people talk about REDD Plus as though they're subject matter experts and that everyone seems to have an opinion. But here we're faced with you, who is a subject matter expert and one of the pioneers who established this. Would love to unpack that with you.
sure. I mean, I was unaware of climate, and of the climate of Kyoto when I started the work, and to say we were the first. Just to be clear, it's always good to be the first at something globally, and even if you have to invent a category to be the first in. So we, as it turns out, we partly did that with Verra's because there were attempts at protecting forests using market mechanism or carbon as a math, an accounting for 30 years, right? Leading up, very few and none particularly successfully. But so what we were is the first project to get certified under the Verra new Verra standard approach for that particular project type. That's what we were, first REDD Plus project under the Verra standard. Not even the first REDD Plus, actually, because TIST, I think, beat us to the post or pipped us at the post. But TIST is a reforestation project. So the first avoided deforestation project is the category that we were first in. And that's really all we were interested in being. We just want to figure out how to find finance for standing forest, natural forest, and the wildlife that calls it home. The people used to come visit me in Kasagawa when we were trying to figure this out, and they would look at the 100,000 hectares, 200,000 acres, and they'd go, "What the hell are you? Why aren't you getting carbon credits?" So after Kyoto, and I would run to the library and read about it. Back in those days, we had to do that. There was no internet, or it wasn't so prevalent. I couldn't ask ChatGPT, how do I benefit from this? So, yeah. So I mean, and every time I checked, it was like, no, not included, not included, not included. So literally 10 years of funding this project with other kinds of activities, protection activities. Obviously, one thing you have to figure out quickly in these projects is does the community need help in physically protecting the forest from outside parties? Not if they're the threat themselves, then they can agree not to be the threat in order for the benefits of the project. But if they're not the threat, if the threat is external, which in many cases it is, then they need money and support to be able to protect their forest against those outside things. So this was the case in Kasagawa. They were partly the threat themselves because they were a slash and burn agricultural community, and they were eating into this corridor between two national parks. And we selected this particular location because it was a corridor between national parks that elephants used. And the conflict between elephants and people is intense in places like that because the people are subsisting. It's not a it's a an intentional use of the word on the crops that they can grow in an area where it's semi-arid to begin with. So they're lucky to get a good crop, and the
Yep.
elephants will come and eat it. Right before the elephants are smart enough to know exactly when they can come and eat it before the people are going to harvest it. And so you have and corn is a grass. It's a very attractive grass for elephants. It's like having a candy store outside the kindergarten. It's like so the elephants all come out and eat the corn and then go back into the national park. And so that was the experience of the community, really, of the elephants, is that they were the enemy. And so I knew that if we could figure out a solution that would turn that around in this location, where, when I first went there, I was in these rooms of people just screaming at each other. Kenya Wildlife Service, that was responsible for the parks and protecting the elephants, is screaming at the community, and the community screaming at them because of this conflict. And so I thought, here's an intense place. If we can figure it out here, then it really has some merit. And it might be a model that we can replicate. So that's why there. The carbon thing, I was made aware of many, many times over the first 10 years, and it just never was an option, really, because I didn't at that point think we could build a standard. I didn't really know what that was, to be honest. Verra's announcement in 2008 that they were going to support this as a standard was really the beginning of our real work to try and make this work. And we started out, we had the project, we started working with CCB first, because CCB existed previously to the VCS, as it was called then, for carbon. Yep. And so we hired a local forestry firm in California to help us to go through the CCB. What kind of a monitoring forest measurement protocol do we need to have for field measurement? How do we teach these local communities to go measure this forest so that we can calculate carbon? So we really were going back. We did destructive harvest. We had to kill a few trees to create curves for carbon content versus diameter of trees at breast height, because Kenya doesn't have a commercial forest species, so they hadn't been studied. Back in those days, very little had been done in terms of carbon quantification anyway. So we had to do all that work, our own alarmetry, and soil measurements of carbon, and we had to measure soil inside and outside the remaining forest to understand how quickly it degraded when farms came and tilled the soil for corn cultivation. So we did a lot of that work using just experts here in the US, because that expertise at that time did not exist in Kenya. The agricultural expertise did exist, and there was places where we could test for soil carbon. But we did all that work, and then we rated. We're like, we're like, okay, Verra, when's the methodology? Like, what's the methodology? And I don't know if you remember this thing, but there was a thing called Avoided Deforestation Partners, AD Partners, that was building the first, what they call now the modules. So the modules within the Verra system are, I can't forget what the number is, VM7 maybe, but the modules. Yep. And this group out of Washington, many of the people there are fantastic people, that are good friends of mine now after all these years. But at that time, we were really looking for a way to do this project, and they were telling us they were going to be finished with this methodology for Verra, and they told me, 3 times it was going to be a month, and that period of time that passed in those 3 times was 6 months. And so I was like, well, you've told me 3 times now, you're a month from finishing, and it's 6 months from the first time you told me that. And so apparently you don't know when you're going to finish. And so I just thought, look, I can't be dependent on, an uncertain future. It's sort of the business impatience in me, was, all right, I need to hire somebody to write a methodology. So I went to Berkeley and found a scientist and hired him. He's still my chief technology officer today. And his job was write a methodology for this project. And the challenge, as I discovered later, which is still a challenge in the market, is that methodology was being developed to boil the ocean. It was intended to be a methodology that would support any project anywhere. I just thought, wow, how's that even going to work? Everything's so different in all these different places. So we wrote, the first version of the methodology we wrote for Verra was avoided unplanned deforestation in dryland forest in southeastern Kenya. That was the methodology. So it was not, it really didn't have an ambition to be of use to anybody except us at that point. Because I was intentional, not because I didn't want a model that would be able to be moved, but because I knew that if we couldn't figure out how to write a very specific methodology that worked in this place, place, then I shouldn't try and figure out how to adapt it to lots of other places, tropical rainforest. So first version was that dryland forest. Second version, later on, we adapted it to tropical wet rainforests when we went to the DRC, which is another story. But that's how it came about. I just got impatient with the process, and then at the end, of course, having invested for a year in developing, or 9 months in developing the methodology, the quote unquote modules came out a week before our methodology was approved. Would you believe it? So we so we weren't the first methodology. The modules came out a week before, but the modules had been working for 2.5 years. And we, I think, if I recall correctly, and we were able to get through the process because it was much narrower, our focus. So that's how we did it. We used that methodology for that project. It's been certified. It had, as you probably know from Verra's process, was that the methodologies had to be double validated by external experts. So the methodology had to go through double validation by experts in the field, selected by Verra. The soil module had a soil scientist from, if I remember correctly, the University of Colorado or something that we had lots of conversations with about our soil module, and eventually got that through his approval. So it was quite, that days, it was really, there was no playbook. We were really making it up as we went along, to be honest. And I would say that even things like FPIC we had to make up, right? Because the concept of FPIC prior to the work that we do and other people in our space was designed by governments and by multilateral banks, where the C was consultation. So, and the whole concept previously had been, I'm coming to build a dam in your community, and I'm going to tell you about it before I show up with the bulldozers. Previous to that version of FPIC, they just used to show up with the bulldozers. And so FPIC was now a next step forward by governments and multilaterals to just basically have this consultation, but there was never a consent process. The community wasn't asked for their consent. They were just being told there's a mine going in over here, or there's a forestry project happening, or this, that, and the other. And so
So just prior informed, not consent.
it was prior informed consultation. Like, we're consulting with you, but we're not going to do anything with what you tell us, basically. The free prior informed consent, for us, it became very clear that if we were going to have a durable project on community land, because it was community land, then the community had to consent to that. Like, how is this not going to work without them consenting to it? We're not going to come in and just do it. So and
it's not sustainable as well, right? Because you need to engage them as shareholders, stakeholders, essentially.
Totally. And which is very well understood now. I'll say, in all fairness, it's very well understood, and that field has evolved enormously in a positive way. There's still practitioners that don't necessarily do it well, but conceptually, it's much better than it was. But at those days, it was nascent. People didn't know what you're talking about when you said free prior informed consent. So why are you asking for consent? You're a business. Just do your project. The government said that to us, and we're like, well, but how can we do the project without the community? It's their land. So we had to sort of invent a consent process with the community, following their own governance. And so that's that. So lots of firsts, lots of things that since the beginning that we've had to be. But in the end, perseverance, because I still to this day, 30 years later, I don't think there's a better option. Like this is the best model for driving finance to these forest communities, and we'll keep pounding away at it and to make it work until there's a better option. And because conservation needs the money, and these communities need the money, and there's lots of arguments about climate justice and equity and all these other things that are served by these projects if they're done well too, that we also feel strongly about.
And can you contrast that just for a second with regards to like something as a callback that you said earlier around market approaches are inherently scalable, whereas the non-for-profit, the philanthropic grant kind of hamster wheel is not scalable. Can you elaborate on that, and also like the finite resources that governments have to support these worthwhile initiatives?
Okay, well, governments are an entirely different animal, because that money is not only finite, it's also political. So as we have had very clearly demonstrated in our own country, I said I wasn't being political, but if the political winds change, then that money gets much smaller, right? And so The philanthropy money, though, is about just, hey, in international philanthropy, it's not a big number relative to the market. It's a small number globally, philanthropy, even though there are very generous people giving billions. It's a small number relative to the multi-trillion dollar market. And a very tiny amount of that philanthropy goes to conservation of wildlife. And a very tiny fraction of that goes to international conservation of wildlife. It's most of the wildlife conservation money goes domestically wherever the donor is because they want to make sure there are more badgers in Essex or whatever the country is. So it'd be and it's an old field. It's not a new field, philanthropy. So it didn't appear to me that scale of money was going to vastly increase, and not with regard to the problem. It's the a level of philanthropy that had been in place, and so it seemed like the market, on the other hand, is enormous. And if you can tie market value to these kinds of activities, you have a much bigger pool to draw from. And you also serve the benefit of engaging corporates in a positive aspect for the solution, rather than constantly criticizing them as the enemy and then expecting them to pay for things. That doesn't never struck me as a very solid way to engage corporates, is make them the enemy and then ask them for money. And so we believe the market needed to be part of the solution. It needed to rethink its engagement because honestly, ultimately, and this is sort of something that Ed asked me about last time I spoke to him, is this notion of how communities in the global South have been engaged traditionally by the market. And in traditionally, absent the sort of infrastructure projects that I mentioned earlier that happen in their community, their other engagement with the global market, it was really as a observer of the pillage of their natural resources by somebody somewhere else in the world that was making good money out of it, and that they themselves were not participating in any significant way in that economic activity. And so I could see that from some of the very early attempts at carbon projects, that there was that risk that carbon projects could go down, as evidenced by the response of government to us going and asking to do this, and them telling us, well, you're a business, just go do what you want to do. And that sort of was the prevalent attitude in the global market, really, that just go do what you want to do, and the communities will have to, suck it up. And so we thought that, again, we didn't think that would ever work for the work we're doing, and so it was never an option. So we felt we needed to engage the market in a very different way, where the market is very aware of part of the job here is fair and equitable participation by these communities. Or in fact, nowadays, the expectation we have is that the communities own the projects, and that the project only happens if the community wants the project to happen, and that anybody like us is a support service to the community making the project happen, rather than the other way around. So it's sort of come a long way, I would say, in the last 15 years. And part of that has been the level of education of the communities. The capacity of communities around the world astonishes me these days. Like, there's very few places. I can't think of the last time I went to a forest anywhere in the world, as remote as possible, and somebody doesn't know about the carbon market, and they don't know about REDD+, and they want their own project. They want to know because there's been enough stories of enough communities around the world getting lots of healthcare, education, infrastructure, jobs, all of these things that now we find communities really want these projects. And now the challenge for the market is scaling to meet that expectation, is one of the big challenges, because that expectation is a global expectation now from these communities, and that no matter how big the carbon market gets, they're certainly not all going to have a carbon project.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly. And thank you so much for sharing those insights. I think it's great to hear from a historical perspective. And fast forwarding to today, and in particular the last few years, REDD+ projects have faced a ton of scrutiny, right? For example, media investigations claimed, some forest carbon offsets were overcredited or not delivering the climate benefits, causing a lot of public skepticism, which is why the market has faced a downturn in prices and liquidity amid that scrutiny in 2023, after record growth in 2021 and 2022. So But these critiques have sparked reforms. So standards have tightened methodologies, and it seems like there's a pivotal moment where the market is all these market stakeholders are coming together to improve integrity. But how do you think these controversies within the Red Plus market have affected the real conversation, right? Have they jeopardized funding or community trust in the projects, or led to positive changes on the ground, or kind of both, the pros and cons of the scrutiny? I'd love to hear your views on this and whether you think Red Plus is on the right track as moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, certainly I'm not going to say that there was no valid. Some of the criticism was deserved and well, and as you say, the market is doing its best to try and address the criticisms that were made that were legitimate. The one thing though that was shocking to me actually, and not many things shocked me, but was the virility of the attacks by the sort of anti-market crowd that
Mhm.
were essentially ideological. It wasn't really about the quality of a project. It wasn't really about the overcrediting of a standard or a methodology. It was really about we don't want to see you exist. We have a problem with your category of thing existing on Earth. So they were the most virulent attacks and the most persistent attacks, and they won't go away to a degree because they have this ideological view, which, putting a different hat on, you can say, okay, the market has been responsible for terrible things on Earth, and should we really be putting our trust in the market to fix things? And so I get the
But,
point.
but can we address that, Mike? Because like
Yeah,
you just talked about and gave a business case for it, right? Like essentially you said
yeah, no,
that
because I'm a pragmatist,
markets
Renee.
scale.
I'm a
Yeah.
I'm a pragmatist. I don't I'm not an ideologist. I'm not an
Mhm.
ideologue. I'm a pragmatist. So while I might sympathize with the point of view academically, intellectually, I can sympathize with that point of view. It's not a practical point of view, in my opinion. It's not and
Mhm.
I'm about solutions for wildlife and forests and communities. So it's not a very productive space for me to spend much time. Right. My productive space is what's a practical solution for driving money, and that answer is the market. And there is no other answer, in my opinion. It's not government. It's not philanthropy. They have a role to play. Don't get me wrong. They have we need everything everywhere all at once to quote the title of that movie, because we're so far behind on so many things but that's part of why I was so shocked is that surely you have something better to do to further your own approach to approving the world and addressing things that are at issue than attacking people who are making a genuine effort to do it in a different way that you don't agree with. I mean, I don't agree with lots of things, but I don't go out of my way to attack them if I who died and made me queen, as we used to say in England. So I had those thoughts a lot. These days you have to say who died and made me king. I guess there's a king in the
Yeah.
UK now.
There's a change.
So, yeah. So, I mean, I was quite surprised by how virulent they are. The genuine criticisms are about are if you're talking about the science behind it, as I mentioned, there's a lot of science behind the work that went into these projects. Always, we've always looked at satellite images. We've always spent lots of time and money interpreting them as accurately as we possibly can. Those of us that are attempting to do responsible projects have always done that. We did the science to know how much carbon is in a forest. We did the science to figure out how fast it was disappearing. A project like Casagao passes the eye test because when you go there, you see this wall of deforestation that's right up to the edge of the project and starts at the other side of the project and goes the other way. And so it's very obviously a corridor that's left. But so we, yeah, the criticisms were harmful for sure. I don't think it's the only thing, and I don't think it's necessarily the most significant thing that damaged the market. If I'm honest, I think there are other things
Yeah.
that were
Can you
equally
unpack it? What do you think?
well. I think the market self-inflicted a significant amount of wounds in response to that criticism. So from an investor perspective, for people, that market dried up not because of the criticism. Investors invest in, all kinds of things that have reputational risk. It wasn't that. It was the inability, the standard body that was at that time, the one that everybody used, stopped the ability for any project to calculate a baseline for a number of years because they announced the new methodology that was going to be the basis for all methodologies, but they didn't issue it. It's, to this day, you still can't create a baseline under that standard. And so with the baseline is the fundamental building block of the economics of any project. And so in our category, in the reduction category, it is the what is the highest likelihood of emissions that would come from this area in the absence of the project. Without that, you can't do anything. You can't figure out how much money you're going to have to invest, how much possibility of reducing emissions you might have. So, that is what stalled the investors in the market was there that, and I could tell you, from me, at least, this is my personal experience, that we had loads of conversations in 21 and 22 with investors that were super excited about the market because everybody saw the frothiness of the sales in 2021 and 2022. But the minute that they wouldn't invest until you could tell them what the potential of a new project is. And the potential of a new project was based on the baseline, always. And so without that, there was no way that they can invest. To this day, I'm having conversations that I started 3 years ago with the same investors, still waiting for me to be able to give them a baseline. They're still waiting to invest. Some of them have been patient about it. Some of them have obviously invested in, pork futures or something. I don't know. But some of them have been waiting. And we're getting closer, in all fairness, we're getting closer on a number of fronts to being able to answer that question. But as of today, I can't answer that question for any of my projects anywhere in the world. Since 2022, I haven't been able to answer that question. And that's what stalled the investment in the market, in my opinion, because everybody's in the same camp that I am in our category. So in our category, you need a baseline before you can determine the economics of your project. It's a fundamental. And so that was one. I would say it was the one of the significant things. The other thing is that the market that existed running up to 2022 was a speculative market dominated by traders and investors. It never built the primary market capacity to absorb credits and retire them for environmental benefit. And part of that has to do with the fact that under the Paris Agreement and all the trickle down effect of that into the corporate world, targets don't really start until 2030. So, companies that they don't really have to make a retirement claim, even if they're in a compliance regime until 2030, many of them. So a lot of this action that was going on for 20 years was just companies trying to figure out how they were going to be able to access credits and which project types and which projects they wanted to work with when they really needed them, and how they were going to stockpile those credits towards their commitments so they didn't have to buy them all in 1 year in 2030. And so that's become increasingly clear. And there was a lot of speculation about that happened that ran the market up in 19, 20, 21, thinking that now the market is coming, we'll hold on to them for a while and benefit when the real commitments come in later in the 20s. And obviously, like, we're getting there now, it's 2025. So that lack of the market finding enough reasons to have people engage and retire early was also a challenge. Because if you're me, you have a primary cost of producing a credit. And it's very hard. People ask me all the time, well, surely by now you must know what that number is. And the answer is no, because it's largely about the opportunity cost for the communities. That's ultimately where it starts, right? The technical costs are not significant relative to the opportunity cost for the community for whatever else they were planning on doing with that land. And so that makes it a little bit difficult and different every place. But there's always an answer that is acceptable to the community from their own perspective. And so that means that I have sort of a minimum threshold for price that below which these projects don't work. You can't get the community incentivized to do this transfer of their livelihoods, essentially, without adequate incentive. So I have a price. The other people that have a price are those companies that do plan to make environmental commitments and mitigate their footprint by retiring credits and making an environmental claim. They have a budget for how much they're willing to spend on doing that. And in the middle, you have a whole bunch of buyers who are hoping that they can get it from me for a price that's less than the corporate wants, and then on sell it to the corporate. And when that didn't happen, when all the volume was stuck with intermediaries in 2022, and they could realize they couldn't just keep trading with each other. That happened a lot in 21 and 22, but it stopped when everybody realized that there's no end game here. And so a lot of the big traders jumped out of the market, and dumped lots of volume into the market, which is really what tanked the prices, is them dumping their volume into the market because they were getting out of it for a period of time. Now they'll be back when the market is more mature, and they have a very important role to play in the market. So this is not about bashing intermediaries. It was just a timing issue that this market has been overhyped for 20 years. So it's a bad idea to start by showing people an up and to the right graph that ends at $4 trillion, right? Or something. So you do that, and then you get everyone interested from the get-go, instead of saying, actually, we have no idea how valuable this market is. We're just going to figure it out as we go along. We know it needs to be really big to be effective and to have the impact that we think it could have in globally mitigating climate. But we shouldn't start out by saying it's going to be a $4 trillion market, and then everybody jumps in at the beginning. So I think that was a bit of a disservice. I don't know, my opinion. But so I think those are other things that affected.
Can I give you some insights from my side? Because I agree with a lot that you said. So for example, I do agree that this, and I'll call it out because I think you're being very diplomatic, but the methodological kind of quagmire that you're trying to navigate was, VM 0007 and this transition towards VM 0048 over at Verra. And to date, I don't think that there's been any projects or any credits currently have issued under VM 48. And essentially, to your point, like I agree on that project developers have been effectively stranded. They've been waiting for this transition to take hold. And that has been deleterious to the market. And buyers on that side are saying, well, we'll just wait until there's projects under this new methodology and this whole question around jurisdictional baselining, et cetera, has been fully addressed. And then created this stranded asset piece on the VM 007 side of things. I think that, and I agree to the fact that what you said around the secondary market then effectively trying to unwind positions around being caught effectively on the wrong side of a trade. But kind of going back to like sitting right at the nucleus of where that market was in the secondary market was really taking off is, when Expansive, when we launched the NGO contract, it created a forward curve and the ability to hedge out on that forward curve specifically. And it incentivized financial intermediaries to want to participate because they could take delivery through futures contracts. That created this acceleration in the market to your earlier point, and created price discovery, all this great stuff. But it actually, in addition to that speculative fervor, as you intimated, I actually saw it, the other side of it, which was corporates now no longer had the luxury of time. They no longer could hold these RFP processes and these payment windows that took, 120 days from start to finish, and could, choose all these projects and go and conduct this extensive due diligence. The reality was the offer wasn't on the screen for long enough. Someone else would just come in and take it away. So it actually spurred greater corporate activity. But it was this double whammy, right? Like the criticisms came, Verra was kind of stuck between two, like a rock and a hard place. And then the confidence was eroded, and essentially now this really critical sector or area within our industry has been stranded to the detriment of communities. And now, obviously, traders, some have unwound, some have exited. I agree on that bit, but I do think that, to your point, like markets can play this catalytic role and achieve scale. And I think we've seen a preview of it. I think we just need to do it in a much better context and better way, learning from the mistakes of the past.
100%. I mean, I'm still firmly committed to that idea. I think the only other thing I would say that was really a detriment to the market, which is in the category of criticism, but was a very specific set of criticism that had nothing to do with the technical aspects of the project. So the example of that is the attack on the claim. And this is the one area, if you remember, there were two initiatives that were launched in the oversight world. There was ICVCM, which was about the integrity of the credit. And then there was VCMI, which was about the claim. And because the claim is what killed the market for us, 100%, that we had these big companies that were committing to carbon neutrality, or as a very simple concept that everybody could understand,
Yeah,
And nobody
that's
was
fair.
fooled into thinking that an oil company doesn't have any emissions because they were saying that some product that they were selling was carbon neutral. I don't think anybody was fooled by that. But the activists attacked that notion broadly, and killed it. And essentially that caused, because imagine you're in a voluntary market and the good
Yeah,
actors that are voluntarily stepping up to spend money to
they're
protect
being
climate
singled out by the
are being
government
singled out and
and
attacked.
civil society.
And
Exactly.
all
That's
the
perverse.
companies that are doing nothing are laughing their socks off, right? They're getting a free
Yeah.
ride. No one's criticizing them for doing nothing. And so that we still haven't solved, to be honest. That how do you replace the claim
Hmm.
with a claim that is a safe claim for corporates to make when they're investing in these things so that they can be rewarded for taking this voluntary action and not criticized. And certainly some corporates were maybe making claims that were inappropriate too, and we're certainly we try and police that. When you're selling credits, you don't want somebody to make a claim that's outrageous. And for us, the issue is we have 1 million credits and somebody buys 10 and makes the same claim that somebody that bought 900,000. That's inappropriate, right? If the claim is about your impact through the project, it's inappropriate. So
Hmm.
we have to police that a little bit and make sure that our clients are clear that, hey, look, we're going to police that you're not overstating your involvement in this project at some point. So we're happy to work with you and make sure that the language is good. But I would say that that's a job that the market hasn't really followed through on with the VCMI, at least from my observation. I don't feel like we've replaced a claim that is confident in that's valuable. I mean, there's two things about a claim, right? It needs to be valuable enough that the company can demonstrate to its shareholders and board that it's worth spending money on, right? Because it's voluntary money, and that means it's coming out of their profits. So companies are, whether we like it or not, they're designed to make profit, and if they can't demonstrate that they're doing something with the objective, at least, to improve their profits, either now or in the future, they won't be allowed to do it. And so they need a claim that is valuable and true. And that's not terribly difficult, I don't think, but I haven't seen a compelling claim out there that has emerged as the safe harbor. There were safe harbor initiatives that have been canceled. So I think I think that's one area that the market still needs to address.
No,
Yeah,
I completely agree on
yeah,
that.
certainly. I mean, we're seeing a ton of, debate around SBTI, now the UNFCCC, and just it seems like, hearing the history of this is that it's kind of been, never ending. And so we'll see what the future holds. But no, I think this is a good transition into talking about Equitable Earth and its journey to ERS. This is a big announcement. And for the audience, Wildlife Works helped create the Equitable Earth standard, specifically designed to put Indigenous people and local communities at the forefront of forest conservation. And, with the big recent development of ERS, Ecosystem Restoration Standard, a Paris-based carbon registry acquiring Equitable Earth, now rebranding as well, they'll take that community-centric standard forward as an independent, scalable program, right? So I think in this segment, I want to explore why Wildlife Works set up Equitable Earth in the first place, and then ultimately handed it off. And what was the gap that it was trying to fill in the market? I think you touched on that a lot from all the challenges you've talked about in your experience. But yeah, lots of questions there, but I would love to just dive into that. And also, why partner with ERS, or why ERS in the first place?
No, great question. So I guess, and we had a little bit of experience, obviously, writing methodology historically, so it wasn't something that we were afraid of. 3 years ago, I could see a lot of these problems coming. I could see a lot of the legitimate criticisms. The court, what was the cause of those legitimate criticisms? What role could the standard have played in avoiding that, and didn't play? And then how would you write a standard in the modern age, knowing everything we now know about where the market is going? In all fairness, Verra was a pioneer across so many different environmental categories of trying to figure out what market mechanisms might even work. And they did an amazing job of creating on-ramps for lots of different types of projects into the market. So, kudos. And we worked very closely with them for many years, still do. But we could see that mistakes were made, and we could see that we felt that the standard had a stronger role, should have had a stronger role in it. And the other thing so that was one part of why we thought there might need to be another one in the market. We thought, well, without competition, real competition, and I recognize there are other standards out there, and I apologize for if any, I'm not implying that they're not real competition, but certainly what we saw in the market with our larger customers, that it was a monopoly, and that wasn't really healthy. That wasn't forcing good decisions in some cases. That was part of what we saw, and we thought that those things need to be addressed. Part of what we saw was that the criticism was driving the market. If you think about a market, you have willing buyer, willing seller, right? Ultimately, that's the market. And then, yes, we've all the people in the middle trying to make it work. But the willing buyer and willing seller both have some level of risk in the transaction, right? Is the willing seller getting enough to support the change that they want to make? Is the buyer getting a decent price that allows them to achieve what they're trying to achieve? And they share a bit of risk. What I saw as a result of the criticisms is that the risk tilted enormously towards the money end, which is often what happens. So it's not somewhat unique in the carbon business, but the risk tilted. But what was lost in that is that it's tilting away from communities. So when you have less risk for the companies that are at the buying end of the market, you have more risk for the communities that are at the selling end, because now they are not able, their ability to generate enough value from their natural assets is diminished significantly. And so we thought that wasn't science. These were policy decisions that were being made to assuage a market that was bruised by the problems, right? And so clearly both sides need to participate in this category more than any other category. Both sides need to have an equitable solution. So part of the answer was that with Equitable Earth is there has to be a more balanced approach to inclusion of the communities in all the important decisions that ensure that the project is designed in a way that gives them the benefits that they need, because ultimately they don't have to do this. This is a voluntary market for them as well. They have options with the land, and the options that they were pursuing, they'd been surviving with for generations. So we're asking them to somehow pick a different option that they're not sure they're going to be able to survive on. And every time they turn around, we're cutting the opportunity down and saying, I'm sorry, it's too risky for the multi-million-dollar corporations. And so that just bothered me a bit. Like, I love multi-million-dollar corporations. I don't get wrong, but those of you that are my clients listening to this, please don't take this the wrong way. But it just seemed unfair and unbalanced, and that ultimately it was short-sighted, because the sustainability is important to both sides. Both sides need sustainability long-term of these projects, and that means an equitable share of risk and an equitable share of reward across that void, and we weren't seeing it. So Equitable Earth decided to work closely with community leaders, and we have a history of working with community leaders, so it was easy for us. We were able to pull together a small coalition. It wasn't a vast coalition in the beginning. It got bigger towards the end when we were able to engage a lot more companies in the process, a lot more developers. But at the beginning, it was a relatively small coalition. And the goal was just, how would you do it now, knowing everything that went wrong? How would CCP is required, right? So how you design that in, right? FPIC has to be robust. Design that in. That all these mishaps happened. Tighten control. Put the standard in control of baseline setting. Put the standard in control of performance monitoring, right? That we knew all of those things, but at the same time, modernize the approach so that you're not just measuring deforestation the way we've done it for 50 years, looking at Landsat images and trying to interpret them to see whether deforestation has happened, which, by the way, is very difficult to do in Kenya. But you're also looking at degradation, because what we know from being on the ground is that degradation of forests can happen for decades before a forest ever shows up as deforested. And those emissions are real emissions that are a substantial amount of the carbon stock of the forest, but they're never being counted. They're not counted in any of the ways that people typically count. So we felt it was very important to include degradation. We also felt it was important that that these projects have a life beyond carbon neutrality for global society in 2050. So that if you've taken on the task of stopping deforestation and you're protecting a forest as a community and it's now growing back and restoring itself, you should benefit from that too. You should be able to benefit from when that carbon stock increases into the future until, of course, at some point it's going to plateau at a new carbon stock, but for at the maximum. But so we looked at a lot of these different things. There's a long way around of saying that we felt the motivation was about equity for communities. The motivation was about efficiency of a methodology that was using modern IT as a way to verify projects. It was using modern and putting the standard much more in control of quality. One of the things that I heard too many times in the market in the period of criticism was standards saying publicly that they were not responsible for quality. I just thought, well, who the hell is? Like it's your standard.
If it's not you, yeah.
If not you, who the hell is responsible for quality? And I think that philosophy and that statement led to a lot of problems, to be honest. And so the idea behind Equitable Earth from the get,
because it put the onus back on the projects, right? And then it bifurcates the signal completely.
Which essentially means you're at the mercy of the bad actors. Your whole system is at the mercy of the bad actors, right? Because the good actors are going to behave themselves and do everything right, and you won't need to police them, and you won't need to worry about their quality. But the bad actors are not. They're going to take any market opportunity. There's always a small portion of bad actors, and so it doesn't matter. I don't care what a field of human endeavor you're talking about. There's somebody that's going to take advantage. So I just seems silly to not put more control in place and not take more responsibility. So one of the principles of Equitable Earth was stand behind the quality of every project, stand behind the quality of every credit. So this notion of a discontinuity in an asset that you have issued is a bit unique. Can't think of another example in modern business where an entity that issues an asset that has a financial value to investors is all of a sudden stepping away from that asset that they issued and saying, "Oh, sorry." And so that
we can't stand behind it, yeah.
Yeah. So I think we said from the beginning, okay, no, everything. How would we design this if the buck stops with the standard and not with the projects, and that projects and therefore the standard? How do you make sure no bad projects get in? How do you make sure that you don't allow gaming of the system? And so that was sort of the design criteria from the get-go, and I think we did a reasonably good job of it. So then, we knew from the very beginning, just to be 100% clear, all the people in the coalition that were developers, and there were other people that weren't developers, but all the ones that were developers in the coalition knew that we could have nothing to do with this standard once it became implemented because of the conflict of interest, a very obvious conflict of interest. So we knew from the beginning we were going to have to find a permanent home for Equitable Earth. And so we started looking, a couple of years ago, just at that time, it was very early for ERS as it happened. And we didn't really find anybody then a couple of years ago that we thought had the capacity to take it on. But we had conversations with all the registries and all the standards, some short, some not so short. And then we kind of resigned ourselves to having to build it from scratch or having to go and find investors on behalf of an entity that we couldn't have any financial interest in, which was odd, having invested all this money in the coalition, which we knew we couldn't benefit from financially. And so we had been going down this path of trying to figure out how would we wanted to be in the global south. We thought, okay, if you're going to be for the global south, you need to be in the global south, that kind of thing. So we had this notion of building it. But then because we had this conversation with the RS, we sort of stayed in contact, and then they came back around 6 months ago and said, "Hey, look, they'd made a lot of progress," and so we started another conversation with them, and at that point, it became very clear the synergy between what they were trying to achieve as an organization and what we wanted to be achieved on behalf of Equitable Earth, and so it became, in the end, a fairly easy decision that they were, in our opinion, somewhat obviously best suited to take on this challenge in the market.
Complementary.
And very complementary, a lot of similar philosophies, very passionate and mission driven, nature-based focus. That's one of the great challenges that Verra still has, and is that they're so broad. That being nature-based only allows you to develop expertise in-house in the nature-based methodologies. And so that's another thing that we felt very strongly about with Equitable Earth. We wanted a partner that knew that it was important for them to be experts in their own methodologies, and that they should be more expert than any of their project developers about their methodologies, and that they were willing to take on that challenge. So I think lots of reasons it became a very easy decision, and we're super happy with it wasn't a condition that we made, by the way, that they rebrand as Equitable Earth, but they have demonstrated their level of passion for this direction that they're taking, and this new methodology by rebranding, and we're super happy about that.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for sharing your insight. Renee, do you have any last thoughts on?
No, I'm just really glad that that's occurred, essentially, right? I think you're absolutely right. I think Thibaut and his team are really great custodians to take this to the next level. I think it's great that, well, firstly to see like that level of engagement, and the way that you've done that, wildlife work, the other stakeholders, to create Equitable Earth, but knowing that you would not be the beneficiaries of that demonstrates to, I think, everybody how sincere you guys are in terms of this mission, right? About effectively delivering outcomes to the communities and to the climate from the global south. So I think that's tremendous, and I think there's a really great pathway here forward for ERS. Now from an organization perspective, now they have two sides of the nature-based solution, right? And we had Thibaut talk about this on the topic, that they started out with a focus on afforestation, reforestation, right? So the removal camp, and now they can focus on avoidance. And I think that's really necessary, because the pendulum is, I think, swung too far one way. I think that the consensus in the market, for some reason, it's just like fashion. It's all removals or nothing. But the reality is you can't do that at scale, and whilst neglecting the existing standing forest. You need to protect those biomes, and you could do both synergistically. And I think that's the approach or the message that comes from that. So I think it's really great.
Yeah, no,
Thank you, Mike.
we're very excited about that. They are great custodians. I think that there's many challenges ahead, but they have a clean slate, right? That's helpful. Really ultimately it was about giving the market choice as well, which is it can't be that fragile that we have a 3-year period because of a decision that gets made by a standard where no project can move ahead, right? That can't be the case. So there has to be more stability in the market and more robustness in the market, and that we think comes from having multiple legitimate options out there as a project developer to go forward with, and both are now firmly in the jurisdictional project camp, which is something we also believe in. We were the first jurisdictional project in the world in DRC with our Mine Dumbe project under the World Bank's Forest Carbon Partnership, and so we believe that is the right approach for stability of the system. But it doesn't mean that the science of the earlier projects was wrong. It was just focused on a different question, which is what is the specific risk to this project, not what is the general risk to forests within this country, and so I think that transition is going to be a bit painful for people that were in the early version, because those projects that were high threat in the past, and because of local activity that was causing that threat, they're now sharing to a large degree that threat across the jurisdiction. So there's a process by which those baselines will be adjusted, some up, some down, good, some, but again, including degradation will help, because ignoring degradation before was a significant detriment to projects, and now including it will help. So we're pretty bullish about the future now. We're pretty excited. The market has a lot of inertia, as you probably know, Renee. We need to find out the paddles to get it going again.
Keep it moving.
Keep it moving.
Can I double click on the jurisdictional piece? And I think, Eddie, I think you might have had that in your run sheet. So I don't want to steal your thunder here,
Um,
but
yeah, I mean, yeah, we could take like this slight pause. We'll have Olaf cut it out. But I had basically the history behind because Red Plus was project based and then it slowly became jurisdictional based on the country scale. But you know, I didn't.
can we go down that rabbit hole, Mike? Can we talk about
I'm
jurisdictional
happy
red?
to. Ed
Yeah,
his editor might be tearing his hair out at this point because it won't be as simple as putting a little title on the front and be good. I'm happy to.
no,
I
that's
mean,
fine. Let's just
really, I
keep it
think
rolling.
it's an important topic, Renee, for sure. In
Yeah.
the sense that the over many times over the last 15 years, we've been told that projects are transitional and temporary. And we
Mhm.
thought, like, in what other industry is that true? In what other industry does the government run all the activity in that market-based activity? There's none. And so the thought for us was that eventually we're going to need both, right? We need the countries to step up to the protection of forests broadly, where there isn't a specific project investment that's viable. They have responsibility for the remainder of the forest estate, right? But they can't invest as much and in as concentrated a fashion as projects can. Projects have a very specific case that they're trying to address, and with a specific community or on behalf of a specific community, and so we just we don't believe we government's role is policy and enforcement, right? Policy and enforcement, 100%. They need to align themselves that way if they want to be successful at solving this problem in their country of deforestation and degradation. But enforcement is very expensive and socially inappropriate in the modern world in many cases,
Mm.
as we've seen from some of the human rights attacks on governments that are essentially protecting their national assets. So, they've made the effort to make a national asset, they put ranges in place, and then the rangers get attacked for keeping people out of the forest. So yeah, I'm simplifying, but the idea is that that's what governments are not good at is the last mile. They're not good at reaching down to figure out how am I going to help this particular community because they can't play favorites and they don't know where to start. So projects can play that role of figuring out where the economics work for a project level investment with communities and address the market directly that way. And the government's responsible for the rest. And it's a pretty straightforward there's a pretty straightforward fix for most of the jurisdictional programs. The challenge, if I'm honest, is that they don't want to fix it. That the proponents largely of jurisdictional approaches don't really like projects. They really like the idea that money is moving between governments. And in the end, let's be honest, the UN is a club of countries. It's the ultimate country club.
Mhm.
And so they don't like the idea that they lose control of this economic value that the UN has essentially handed them on a plate if they want to participate in the carbon markets. But as I said, most of them are realizing that that isn't the right answer for them, where they're in control of everything. Because if they were able to succeed at that now, they would be doing a much better job. And it's super complicated in these countries that have very little resources to begin with in many cases.
I was going to come back to that point. I think that's the bit, right? Like they just lack the ability to implement and the resources. So
They
it's
do.
silly to just have this kind of dichotomy between jurisdictional and like government and private sector. I think that there's an opportunity for a public-private partnership to leverage the private sector innovation, speed to scale, etc., and the risk taking on the private sector side, and then, like you said, enforcement and the policy direction, so that there is a cohesive approach to focus on the outcome, right? It's to protect those nature-based solutions and the communities that thrive and benefit, as well as the other species that thrive and benefit.
Yeah, completely. And I think, incentive, this is an incentive mechanism, whether it's at the government scale or whether it's at if the market's involved, it's an incentive mechanism. We're
Mhm.
betting that money is going to incentivize action that will support protection of the forest and biodiversity. Whether it's betting that the government getting money will incentivize it or communities getting money, we're betting that it's an incentive that is important. And that incentive in the case of communities is because they need the money. It's not like we're bribing them. We need the money. They need the money to change their livelihoods and move away from resource extraction if that's what was supporting them, or to keep the threats at bay. So it's an incentive mechanism. The worst design for there's if you know from my business life, the critical element, we used to do this all the time for really big companies that many of them had many more employees than the communities we work with. If you design an incentive for somebody that they have absolutely no control over, it's going to fail. Because the whole point is you're incentivizing them to do something that was within their control. And if they do it, you reward them. You can't, if you design a system where either you create an incentive that they aren't in control of, or you create an incentive that they are in control of, but someone else's behavior somewhere else can nullify the advantage that they're going to get from doing what you asked them to do for the incentive you were willing to give them, that is a terrible incentive design. That's the problem with jurisdictional only solutions. The problem with jurisdictional only solutions is that the bad actors in that jurisdiction can just be bad and they can kill the whole system because their emissions get counted alongside the emission reductions of the projects that are being successful or the government programs that are being successful. And if all you're doing is counting at the net level and saying we're only rewarding this country when its net emissions in the whole country go down, many countries will never get there, never start, because the bad actors just know I can kill this incentive mechanism just by going and doing what I like to do, deforest more and stay out in front of the successful projects and the successful government efforts. And so it's a terrible incentive mechanism that requires then enforcement against the negative actors in order for the incentive mechanism to be able to take effect. And so the projects allow you to really focus incentive and reward incentive when performance that is in the control of a community happens and you can reward it through the market. And then you through that, that cannot be disrupted. You know, their job is to stop that forest from being deforested by local bad actors. If they do that, the local bad actors have to go somewhere else to try and ply their trade. And one after the other, you protect these forests through a mechanism like that. Eventually, you have enough where the net positive benefit accrues at the national scale. But you can't start at the
and you have an incentive for more good actors to come in to displace
totally.
those
You have
bad
an
actors.
incentive for more good actors, more investment. Everything is exactly the way incentive mechanisms are supposed to be designed. The jurisdictional only program
There's a positive feedback loop
is a
as
positive
opposed to a
feedback.
negative one.
Yeah, exactly, 100%. So that's been our philosophy forever. I can't tell you how many arguments I've had with the jurisdictional crowd about this matter, and there is an ideological argument on their point. They believe that
It is.
it doesn't matter that I mean, I've literally had people say, "Well, you haven't created any emission reduction." I'm like, "Well, what are you talking about?" They said, "Well, look at the national number; it's still going up." I'm like, "That's not our fault. Look at our number; it's going down." Oh, well, then clearly, you weren't the threatened forest. I'm like, no, you're not, or it's leakage. That's the other argument we get all the time, is that, oh, the national number is going up. Your project was successful. It must be leakage. I'm like, leakage should absolutely be the government's responsibility, with very few obvious exceptions of companies that have multiple areas of forest that they're mismanaging in some way. But that's easy to root out. What's impossible is to say that Project A that has this forest that they're responsible for has to worry about what happens to Project B or Forest B that's 100 miles away, or et cetera. And so some of those things are challenges that the market has set itself, because to a large degree, when this was an academic exercise, and it still is an academic exercise for a lot of people, you can think of a million things that could go wrong in them. But the practical, we always come back to the practical and like, how do we really use this tool to drive money to these forest communities? Because we need this transfer of wealth to the global south in order that these communities in the global south can help us solve a problem that we created, and that they're now suffering from disproportionately. So
Yeah.
that's what we think about.
Yeah.
It should be a both. It should be a both. It should never be an either or.
Yeah.
It should be a collaboration, and it is. In the countries that we work in, it's a collaboration between the projects and the government in most of the countries we work in.
Yeah. Well, really, grateful for your takes. I really liked listening to your perspectives there. So thank you so much for joining the conversation, and really appreciate your time. Now I think we're gonna have to wrap up soon. But I guess I'll squeeze in one final question. Given all the developments and topics we discussed today, and I guess in a few sentences, what makes you the most optimistic about the future of the carbon markets?
The absence of a viable alternative. I mean, so I don't know if that's optimism or it's a resignation. that and stubbornness. So that maybe it's more stubborn. I think one thing that I am optimistic about, but it also will bring challenges, is just how fast um, global communities switched their perspective from this is something that threatens us and our future to this is something that can help us achieve our future. I think that has been amazing to me to see how that has happened in rural, indigenous communities in the Amazon and
Mm.
indigenous communities in Cambodia and indigenous communities in Indonesia. And so that's one thing that makes me very optimistic is that there's not resistance.
They
There's,
they
there's
see the physical challenges of the climate changing itself, right? Because
Totally, and they do, and they're not PhDs in climate science, but they see the impact and on their own life, whether it's fires in the Amazon or whether it's drought in Africa, they see it and they're facing it, and they want to do what they can to help, but they also have far less options and they're also much more in a precarious position, many of them, because of the threat that they're under from people that would rather use their land and their forest for other, greedy economic purposes, shall we say?
Mhm.
And so it is a really challenging time for them. But the speed at which those communities learn from each other is amazing to me. The not, and I'm not just talking about that level of sort of NGO infrastructure that exists for communities to talk to each other around the world is unbelievable, and it sort of happens through some process that in the last 5 years I'd say it's been incredible. So that makes me optimistic. I think the ultimately um, that this is still the best solution, and it is a solution that corporates should be proud to participate in because it can help meet their climate ambitions as well as other ambitions they may have for other SDGs, like et cetera. So it's really the only category of credit that does that. And so I think ultimately corporates will come back to it because of that. But I do think uh, and I do think that the UN work to drive Article 6 will have a positive effect. I think it's just, inordinately slow is the challenge, but I think it will have a positive effect. It is having a positive effect in some countries already. So everything is important, and I think it's all pointing in the right direction. I find it strange that there are still these sort of fabricated conflicts. Like, oh, there's the jurisdictional camp and the project camp. I mean, come on, man, it's the same planet, and we're talking about the
Yeah.
same work that needs to be done by everyone, and we're not enough all together. So what the hell are we doing fighting with each other about it? So I feel optimistic that some of the lessons of, hey, let's be more careful about this because what is the alternative? There isn't really a good one, so and then stubbornness and
yeah,
um, is probably part of the reason why I'm still doing it. And I literally am passionate for the solution. I really love wildlife. So,
yeah,
and I do not see another outcome that protects wildlife as effective a way than getting communities to want that wildlife and wilderness in their community because it generates real value for them that is enabling them to pursue their own futures.
yeah. Well, maybe we could talk about biodiversity credits on another time. But again, Mike, thank you for the masterclass. Really appreciate it. And Renee, do you have any last thoughts?
Nope.
Appreciate
Mike,
your input as
thank you for
well.
your time and for your insights. That was super. And thank you for all the work that you've done and the passion that you exhibit every day. And it's always refreshing when we get to catch up and we get to speak with you. But like you're one of the pioneers of our market, right? And we stand on the shoulders of giants. So thank you for everything you've put in for not only yourself, but your entire team and the communities that you represent. So thank you so much.
No, thank you guys for your great work, and may it long continue.
Yeah.
Thanks, man.
Well, to our audience, thanks for tuning in to This Week in Carbon. Be sure to check out this episode and share it with someone that's interested. Shameless plug.